Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Margarita Castroman, and I'm an affiliate faculty member of the Center for African and African American Studies and assistant professor in the Department of English here at Rice. I will be introducing our distinguished guest today. Then following the talk, we will have some time for Q&A, which will be moderated by Kimberly Jones, PhD candidate in the History Department, who is writing a fantastic dissertation on slavery and disability in Virginia. Remember that you don't have to wait until that portion of our event to write out your question. Feel free to use the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your screen. You can do that at any point in the talk. Finally, I'll return to close and give you some upcoming events with CAAS. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today Professor Jomaira C. Figueroa-Vásquez, an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, teacher, and scholar from Hoboken, New Jersey. Professor Figueroa-Vásquez earned her MA and PhD in Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and her BA in English, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic Caribbean Studies and Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She is currently an Associate Professor of Afro-Diaspora Studies at Michigan State University and the author of the absolutely fantastic book, Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature, published with Northwestern in 2020. Her published work can be found in Hipatia, Decolonization, Centro, Small Acts, Frontiers, Hispanophilia, Contemporánea, Post-45 Contemporaries, and Essex Salon. I mean, basically anywhere that radical interdisciplinary work is being published. She is a founder of the MSc Women of Color Initiative, hashtag Proyecto Palabras PR, and the DH project, Electric Marinage. Dr. Figueroa-Vásquez is a 2015 to 2017 Duke University Mellon Mays SITPA Fellow, a 2017-2018 Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow, and a 2021-2022 Cornell University Society for the Humanities Fellow. She is, by all accounts, a brilliant scholar whose work expands, remaps, and reimagines Latinx and Afro-Latinx and Afro-Atlantic studies. It is a privilege to have you here with us, Dr. Figueroa-Vásquez, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Castroman, for having me, for inviting me here. I also want to thank all of the faculty, the staff, the graduate students, and all the tech support that make these events possible. And I also want to thank the Center for African American and African Studies for the invitation, the opportunity to share this work with you. I'm going to talk today about my book project, Decolonizing Diasporas. I'm going to share my screen right now and present a slide show. Okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being with us at this late hour, or what I consider late hour. I'm on East Coast time, so it's like 7:30 p.m. I know for those of you at 6:30, it still is kind of late. So I really appreciate the time that you are lending to us here and to me here to kind of engage. And I would love to have a conversation with you afterwards. So please don't feel shy about asking questions, any questions you want. I'm happy to engage in the conversation. So the title of the talk today is Intimacies to Apocalypso, Afro-Latinx Studies in Afro-Atlantic Context. And I'm going to begin the talk by, let me see here, by talking a little bit about myself and my own background and how I come to this work. I believe that this is really important for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons that this has been really important to me to kind of situate this within a lot of the talks that I do is because oftentimes as scholars, as students, as faculty, as writers, as researchers, we're often taught to decenter ourselves, to kind of take on universalist or some type of objective positioning, right? And that is like the only source of like true knowledge and writing and thinking. But in reality, we know that this is a farce, right? That there is no one who is truly objective, that universalisms don't exist. And so for me, it's really important to kind of mention the kinds of ethics and worldviews that really have informed the way that I take up my work and take up the questions in my work. So I'm a first generation, Afro-Puerto Rican. My parents are from Vega Baja, Puerto Rico, in caaas, Puerto Rico. I was born and raised mostly in Hoboken, New Jersey, with the traqueteo going back and forth to Puerto Rico, and also to Brooklyn, where the rest of my family is at. Here you have photos of El Alto de Cuba, Tomás de Castro in Caguas. And on one end, so the mountains and the kind of valleys of where my mother's family is from. And then you have a view of Hoboken, which is a 1 square mile city that faces lower Manhattan on the Hudson River. And here you have a sense of like both the projects and the tenements, which are the places where I grew up in a working poor, working class family. I'm also a first generation high school graduate and college graduate and so on. And so these photos here of me and my parents, and I never really noticed until a few like times into presenting this talk or doing my talk that both of these photos are graduation photos, right? The one is my first grade graduation with my father, who was able to study up to the 3rd grade in Vega Baja. And the other one is with my mother at my PhD graduation at Berkeley. And I find those to be really incredible. My mother was able to study to the 8th grade. And so my parents always thought education was really important, but they didn't really have, or they believed that they didn't really have the tools to guide me. But it was so much of what I learned from them and being around them and in this community in Hoboken and this kind of transnational community, right? Being in Puerto Rico and this diasporic community that really helped shape who I am as a thinker and as a scholar and how and whose ideas, knowledges, and thinking I value most in this world. And I really urge for those folks who are working and writing right now, folks who are students and even folks who are well-worn in the profession to really consider how we come up and how that really shapes who we are, what we think, and whose knowledge is important. I always find that to be so critical. So I'm gonna jump in really quick and talk about decolonizing diasporas. So this is my first book project, and it came out about a year ago, a little bit like a year and a few weeks ago. And so in this book, you see here this map, and this is a kind of an expanse map, a map that was actually created for my book by one of my graduate students, Angelica de Jesus, who is incredible with ArcGIS. And we call her Map Mommy. So she's really good at it. And so I just have to give her props because I didn't do this myself, So in this map, what we see is this kind of relational and diasporic expanse. The project itself takes up some questions. It takes up the question of Afro-Latinx studies, but it does so in thinking about this in a longer Afro-Atlantic context, right? So I was really interested in kind of tracing the long histories of connections and relations between the Afro-Latinx Caribbean, so Afro-Cuban, Afro-Puerto Rican, and Afro-Dominican work in the diaspora in relationship to Equatorial Guinea. So the only Spanish-speaking nation state in sub-Saharan Africa, and the majority of its work being produced in exile and diaspora in Spain. So in this way, it was very much a diasporic conversation, right? A kind of south-to-south dialogue happening in the global north, right? But in order to get here, I really had to trace these longer histories, right? Particularly these 19th century histories of transatlantic crossings between the Caribbean and actually the Pacific as well, and Guinea Equatorial, or what it was called then Spanish Guinea. So as colonies of Spain, these places have a long kind of colonial connection, but interestingly enough, in the 19th century, both Cuban, Puerto Rican, as well as Filipino anti-colonial agitators were kidnapped by the Spanish and deported to a penal colony in Equatorial Guinea, right? And then also in the 19th century, we have the kind of longer history of emancipados or emancipated Cuban slaves who were also deported to Equatorial Guinea to Fernando Po, the island that is now Bioko. So we have these long kind of connections, and I kind of encountered this by looking at the history of particularly the linguistics of Equatorial Guinea. So there's all of these linguistic studies that are trying to trace the phenomenon of why this like African Spanish colony, former colony, has these kind of Caribbean lilt in their speaking. Like how is it that they have these like Cuban and kind of Spanish Caribbean accents, right? So that's how I was able to kind of trace this longer history. But what's interesting to me as well is thinking about the long legacies of the Spanish-American War, because it was very much that Equatorial Guinea was kind of a forgotten colony, a kind of abandoned colony by Spain, one that served as a penal colony in many ways. But when the Spanish lose the Spanish-American War in 1898, and they lose by extension their final colonies in the Pacific and the Caribbean, they renewed attention to the remaining African colonies, in particular to Spanish Guinea, right, what is now Equatorial Guinea. And they recolonized Equatorial Guinea in earnest. And in doing so, consolidate some of both the kind of main continental swath, which I'll show you in a second, and the primary island, as well as some of the other islands that were under the colonial heel of of Portugal and other places, right? So it's really interesting to think about the ways that the direct impacts of the Spanish American War then lends itself to the recolonization of Equatorial Guinea until 1968, right? So from 1898 to 1968, this becomes a true new colony in earnest. And then after that, I was thinking through some of the ways that the poetics are related to each other. So we have these poetic odes written by Ecuatorianos to folks like Nicolás Guillén, right? Writing to these Afro-Cuban poets who are allá en viaje en las Antillas, right? Like half Africans, right? Living in the Antilles, right? And so I was really interested in both the kind of historical and material connections, as well as these kind of poetic connections. I was also really thinking about the question of the periphery, right? And I was considering both from the perspective of Dominican studies, and particularly building on the work of Silvio Torres Sayan and Ramon Hernandez in their book, Dominican Americans, where they talk about, and this is like a 1990s text, where they talk about, if Latinx studies at that time is marginal, then Dominican studies is peripheral to that margin, right? And I really like thinking about that, particularly in relationship to, and even against something like world systems theory that takes kind of like a much larger approach to thinking about the core and the periphery. But what would it mean for us to think about what is the periphery of the margin in this context? Now, I think that transnational Dominican studies has come a long way since the 1990s. There's this incredible boom in transnational Dominican studies. There's all these amazing Dominican studies scholars, like they're just killing it and just doing incredible work. But I still think that the question of the periphery of the margin for me really was so incisive, particularly when I was thinking about Equatorial Guinea and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Because Equatorial Guinea is surrounded by Francophone, Anglophone, and Lusophone nation states, and because it is the only Spanish-speaking country in sub-Saharan Africa, what we see is that the literature that is produced, right, from Guinea, particularly under the current regime, right? So they go from, colony to dictatorship, basically, and they're continuing to be under dictatorship today. What we see is this huge repression of the work, but also a lack of circulation due to the fact that it is produced in this language where the neighboring countries, don't have that as their lingua franca, right? So as a result, we don't see the literature of Equatorial Guinea being discussed as part of the African literary canon. The fact that the majority of the work is also produced or published in Spain doesn't mean that it becomes part of Spanish letters, even though it's produced by former colonial subjects, right? So really, we see this as really a body of work that is both urgent and peripheralized in many ways. Not to mention that the work from Equatorial Guinea is often not discussed in African studies. It's not necessarily discussed in Latin American or Latinx or Caribbean studies, right? There's a kind of lack of connection on our end in terms of thinking about Caribbean, Latin American studies to make that kind of concrete connection to Africa. And a lot of that has to do with our own contentions with anti-Blackness, right? And the ways that we consider ourselves hemispheric and not oftentimes transnational in that context. But one of the places that Equatorial Guinea is studied is in Spanish departments, right? And also in linguistic studies departments as well. However, many of those works often think about Equatorial Guinea as kind of thinking about it as an extension of, or as a reflection of the legacies of democracy in Spain. So what would it mean to take up this work on its own terms for what it offers us? And what would it mean to put African peoples, Black peoples, right, in relationship to other Afro-Atlantic subjects and actually other former colonial subjects of the same ilk? On the other side of the Atlantic, we have this Caribbean contingent, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean contingent, this set of archipelagos that are often kind of talked about in relationship to each other many times, collapsed either in the kind of dual or even the trifecta of the three. And so there's lots of work in this field. However, we know that within the larger field of what is like Latino or Chicano studies, that the Latinx Caribbean really oftentimes falls out of the mix, right? In many ways, not to mention that both Afro and Indigenous Latinx studies is oftentimes peripheralized, even within our fields that that attempt, right, to take up so much of what is important and all that is offered. And when we think about the publication of the work, we know that we're dealing with white supremacist markets and logics that oftentimes means that there can only be one winner, one Black Latino writer at a time, right? And so these are the kinds of ways that I have thought about these places as being the periphery of the margin, and also think about what would it mean to kind of take the view from outside, right? The kind of peripheral view, and put them in conversation with one another. What can they tell us about colonization and decolonization? What can they tell us about knowledge and bodies and the erotic and liberation, right? How can they inform and instruct us in some of the kinds of primary and important questions that we have been asking ourselves for a very long time, right? I often think about this in the kind of sense of if there is like a revolú or like a little fight going on in a room, right? Like if there's like a tussle going on, who can tell you what's happening there? Is it the people that are in the fight at the moment, or the people who are standing around the room looking and telling you like, this is where this happened and that's how that happened, right? How can that illuminate a different perspective for us? And so for me, this kind of thinking about this relational and diasporic experience is also one that takes seriously the knowledges, the belief systems, the practices, the languages, and the stories of people who are oftentimes left out, silenced, and ignored. So here I have a little bit more of like a close-up map. So on the one hand, we have the map of Cuba, Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and Puerto Rico. This is a map that we kind of know pretty well, right? It's like on our side of the hemisphere, right? Like it's on our side of the world, and we have kind of a sense of what the Caribbean looks like. But I was really, for me, drawn into these maps by thinking through not just these as islands, but as archipelagos, both as nation states, right, or as nations, but also in relationship to one another. On the other side, we have a map of Equatorial Guinea, something that we might not have a good sense of, right? Something that I didn't really have a good sense of until I was studying it and went there, right? And so Equatorial Guinea is a small swath of the like continents, right, between Cameroon and Gabon. And then it also has these 5 islands. So it has, I don't know, can you guys see my mouse when I roll over the mouse? Yeah, okay. So it has Bioko, which is basically the seat of power. This is an island that used to be called Fernando Po. It was first colonized by the Portuguese. And then it became Bioko after their administrative decolonization. And the main city here that is important is Malabo. That is the seat of power. That is where both the kind of petroleum conglomerates hang out, as well as kind of where you can fly into the country. And one important thing to note here is that the island of Bioko is an island that the Bubi population is autochthonous to. However, the people who rule Equatorial Guinea are of the Fang ethnic group, right? Particularly the Mongomo clan of the Fang ethnic group. So we can think about those kind of intra-ethnic tensions that are happening within the space, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Furthermore, there's Eloe Chico, Eloe Grande, islands that are arguably uninhabited. There's Corisco, which is an island that is autochthonous to the Ndowe. And then all the way down here at the bottom, Annobon. This is probably one of the only maps of Equatorial Guinea where you will see Annobon. Oftentimes, and this is again, my grad student Angelica Jesus did a great job. Oftentimes, Annobon is not even visible on a map of Equatorial Guinea because it is so far away from the nation state, and also so small, right? But for me, it was really important to know Annobon because this island is so both politically important, but also the site of some of the most insurgent thinking coming out of Equatorial Guinea. You'll see how close Annobon is to São Tomé and Príncipe, also former Portuguese colonies. And Annobon is a little bit different than the rest of Equatorial Guinea in that they not only speak Spanish as a lingua franca, but they speak a language called Fala-Diambo or Annobonese, their own kind of Portuguese Creole from the many hundreds of years that they were colonized by the Portuguese. So I wanted to kind of show this because one of the things that became really clear to me as I was thinking about this project that was trying to think through the connections between the Latinx Caribbean and Hispanophone Africa was the importance of islands, right? The way that within this nation state, even though the continental piece is the largest piece, the sites of power and of contestation are mostly these island places, right? The majority of the people who are writing through and about these islands. And it made me think about the archipelago and archipelago studies, right? What would it mean for us to think from the perspective of islands versus from the perspective of the quote unquote mainland, right? Or what Craig Santos Perez calls the imperial terrapelago, right? And so this map is called Of Islands and Other Mothers. It is from a book called Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas. And this map is really cool to me because it shows an interesting kind of cartography. It shows the islands of the Caribbean smashed together with the islands of New York City, right? And this way, rendering visible for us something that we have long said in Latinx studies, which is that New York, Miami, Chicago, right? All of these places are extensions of the Caribbean. by virtue and by nature of the large swath of migration and diaspora to these places, right? So what would it mean for us to render visible a different kind of map, one that reflects human geography rather than the kinds of imperial cartographies that we are often given, right? Thinking through archipelago studies necessarily brought me to thinking about the kind of work, again, to the Pacific, and thinking about Oceania and the kinds of indigenous Pacific island studies and the ways that they're thinking about islands, particularly the work of Apeli Haufa, who wrote Our Sea of Islands, and their perspective as so instructive to me to rethink how to kind of privilege the points of view and the perspectives of folks who are writing from and about these places from that kind of deep connection, right, to these land formations. So one kind of important part of this project has been the kinds of frameworks that have really grounded me and really shaped how I approach the work. And one is thinking through women of color feminisms and Black feminist thought, particularly their work on relationality, and the other is thinking through decolonial feminisms and the ways that these works come together and have, have really helped me shape this work. And so as I'm thinking about this work, I wasn't necessarily thinking about Afro-Latinx studies and Afro-Hispanic film studies as a comparative analysis. Rather, I was thinking about them in a relational context. And the reason why is because I thought that a kind of simple comparison would be really reductive, in that it would not allow me to be able to talk about the deep differences and the difficulties of doing such a project. And so for me, the work of women of color, feminists, writers, and poets have been important in doing this. And so I have these quotes here. Audre Lorde, she argues in Sister Outsider that the future of our earth may depend upon the ability of all women to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference. She says, we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. And I argue that that because of this, we stand to be fractured from one another and ourselves. And I think about this also in the context of decolonial thought. I'm thinking about the colonial difference, right? The colonial difference is one that introduces the idea of differences as hierarchies, right? And so one of the knee-jerk reactions against that is kind of this idea that we don't see any differences. I don't see color, I don't see difference, we're all the same, right? And that is the kind of futile move because there are differences exist and they're important, right? The question is, are we creating these differences into hierarchies? How are we able to create patterns for relating across differences in ways that don't already subject us to the kind of violent categorizations that we have inherited? So the project of relations is a lifetime pursuit. This is what Jackie Alexander offers us, one that women of color feminists have kept alive as a politics and as a praxis. It is a methodology of complex coalition building, of learning each other's histories, of understanding why difference fragments communities in search of liberation. And here I have a quote from Chandra Mohanty that says, it is not color or sex that constructs the ground for these struggles, rather it is the way we think about race, class, gender, and the political links we choose to make among and between struggles, right? So for me, linking this to decolonial feminisms, right? Feminisms that considers and takes seriously the kind of long history of colonization, right? From the 15th century to the present, right? Taking that kind of longer historical context to it. One that is thinking about the kinds of systems of power, knowledge, body, gender that we have inherited, right? Has become really important in bringing this thinking together, right? So decolonial feminisms have sought to think through and beyond the ways that colonial hierarchies of the human seek to fragment peoples categorically, and instead find ways to engage with indifference and find what Maria Lugones called possible companions in resistance. And I always think about that. What would it mean for us to be able to find possible companions in resistance, to know that we're not at this alone, right? Laura Perez argues that a decolonizing politics must introduce, engage, and circulate previously unseen, marginalized, stigmatized notions of spirituality, philosophy, gender, sexuality, art, or any other category of knowledge and existence. And this I love, right? Like this is very clear. Decolonizing must introduce, must circulate, right? Must engage these unseen, these silenced, these marginalized, these stigmatized understandings, right? These knowledges, right? And all of these practices. And that's something that was kind of at the fore of thinking through this project. If I'm thinking about African and Afro-descended subjects, what would it mean to take their knowledge, their practices, their beliefs, their understandings of gender and sexuality and art and all these categories of knowledge seriously, right? And to say like this actually is the path forward to think differently about the kinds of world that we have inherited, right, in colonial modernity. However, one of the things that really was clear to me was that I had to be really careful in doing this project, which is why relationality was important to me, but I had to take it a step beyond that. And so here I have this slide on the critical cartography of racialization. This is a photo of Annobon, the island of Annobon. But I wanted to think about, so before I read this slide, I wanted to think about what would it mean for me to take up and to think with the literature of Equatorial Guinea, and to do so in a way that was ethical and engaged with the kinds of everyday struggles that were happening within the nation and in diaspora, right? What would it mean, for example, if I, as a scholar, were like, okay, I'm gonna read the literature of Equatorial Guinea, and all this literature does this thing, right? Like all these Equatorial Guineanos believe this, without paying attention to the kind of phenomena that I hinted at, which is like the nation is run by a particular ethnic group from a particular clan, right? Like they're running the nation state from this island that is the indigenous land of this other ethnic group that is being consistently suppressed, right? What would it mean for me to think about like Annobon and Corisco within this context as well, right? And so for me, it became really important to kind of make note of the fact that not only is like the lingua franca Spanish, but if you go to Equatorial Guinea, folks are speaking their indigenous languages. It's like the streets are just full of languages, right? Speaking their indigenous languages, have their own indigenous practices, customs, belief systems. There are folks who are beefing. There are folks who are dealing with, some would say like this is an attempt at genocide, right? Or to erase us, right? And so for me, it was really important to say like, no, I actually can't talk about this as if it is, a homogeneous, group, and a literature that is like unified in a particular kind of struggle, right? However, I knew that because the majority of the work is being produced in diaspora because of the dictatorship, those differences are very real within Equatorial Guinea are not recognized within Spain, right? In Spain, no one is saying like, oh, well, you're Fang, right? Like, no, you're an African, like every other Black person, right? And they have to deal with the forms of anti-Blackness that is like so deeply entrenched in Spanish culture, right? And so within the context of Spain, even though they're former colonial subjects, there's no sense that like there is a recognition of those deep differences that really are important within the kind of like homelands, right? And so in this project, I was like, okay, how am I gonna write about this without like both pissing somebody off, right? Like if I'm talking to authors that are like Bubi or Anabones or whatever, and I have this author that's saying like, how do I make sure that I don't like piss them off by being like, oh yes, the struggle of the whatever. They'll be like, nah, like that's not what's going on, right? Like how do I make sure that I do right by this work and address this? But I also have to recognize that, the majority of people are living under dictatorship. They have to contend with anti-Blackness in the diaspora. So I was thinking about the critical cartography of racialization as a way to map in some way or to trace and hold space for the different ways that anti-Blackness and the colonial difference imbues both the former colony as well as the kind of diasporic metropole space, right? So this kind of relational cartography is always moving, right? And I'm particularly interested in the way that it marks the lives of Afro-diasporic peoples and how it to be able to an ability for us to be able to outline, right? Both how folks are oftentimes fixed in a particular kind of identity, but also how those identities can shift depending on where they move, right? So I have here that really impact their racial, ethnic, ontological, and phenomenological experiences that emerge when moving across spatial and temporal locales. And I don't think this is just solely for Equatorial Guinea, because on the other side of the Atlantic, we have a very similar phenomenon going on, right? We have folks who are within and across both these archipelagic and diasporic places that are contending with the long legacies of mestizaje, right? This failed racial democratic project that attempts to erase the forms of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. They're like endemic to it, right? A way that we can erase the deep forms of racism and discrimination and violence that is inflicted upon the bodies and lives of Black and Indigenous peoples. At the same time that you could say no, it doesn't matter, we're all we're all Cuban, or we're all Puerto Rican, or we're all Dominican. There's no such thing as race. You imported that from the United States, right? But then you can turn around and be like, oh, but you have bad hair, right? Or, you know, like you need to better the race. You need to marry lighter so you can better the race, right? Or you can say, you know, cada oveja con su pareja, right? Every sheep with its pair, you don't want to mix, right? Like, so there's all of this really interesting thing in which our actual actions and words belie, right? The kind of racial democratic sentiment of mestizaje. And when we move, right, and we're shifting to this kind of diasporic space, particularly this Anglo diasporic space where the racial logics at play are not mestizaje, but hypo descent, what do we do then? We're confronted with a completely different racial logic, one that says, you know, we have to protect whiteness at all costs, right? The one drop rule means like if you have one drop of this non-white blood, you're Black or you're other or whatever the case may be, right? And this is something that is enshrined or has been enshrined in the law in the United States for hundreds of years, right? Up until like the 1990s, right? Like we have these cases on file of folks trying to figure out, why am I categorized as a Negro if I'm only 1/38 Black, you know? How is this possible, right? And so for me, I'm really interested in the kind of moment of like that crashing of these two racial ideologies. One in which like, we're not Black, we're not this, we're never this thing, right? Or if you're doing that, you're a complejada, you have like a complex, or, you know, you're importing these ideas. And this other one that says like, you are always already othered, right? You're always already Black. And the ways that moving across these, and oftentimes you don't have to like leave far to cross these. Like you could like literally step out of your house in the Bronx, right? Like, like inside the house is one thing, you step outside, it's a whole other like thing, right? And thinking about the way that your subjective experiences can change depending on where you go, right? One of the things that happened to me growing up in a very Puerto Rican neighborhood, in a Puerto Rican city where the like between 30 and 40% of the population were Puerto Rican, right? Was that there was a very easy legibility of who we were as a people. People would talk to you in Spanish, and you know, there was no confusion about who you were, right? When I went to graduate school in California, I remember introducing myself in one of my very first seminars and being like, you know, I'm Jomaira, you know, I'm Puerto Rican, blah, 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 blah. And after class, one of my classmates came up to me on the street and he was like, yo, I don't know what you were talking about in that seminar, all that Puerto Rican shit. Here in California, you're just Black. You gotta stop saying that. And I was like, oh, excuse me. You know what I'm saying? Like apparently, right? Like this particular claim to being Puerto Rican is an affront to Blackness rather than the possibility of being a Black Puerto Rican, right? Like, and so for me, that becomes a way to, how do we think about how our racial, the way that we are read, right, changes when we move from place to place. And so this is basically the kind of concept of the critical cartography of racialization as a way to think through both the kind of subjective and the sociogenic principle, right, of how race and racialized gender operate within the work. Okay, back. So now we laid this groundwork. I talked about relationality. I'm basically giving you here the introduction to the book itself, and giving you a sense of like how I move, how I build to move towards the rest of the book itself. So basically, relations is the introduction, is basically what you heard me say right now, the whole thing. And then I move on from there to thinking about intimacies, right? The first chapter of the book is Intimacies. And in this chapter, I trace the ways that Black women, girls and femmes, are enacting forms of erotic freedom and corporeal consciousness, what Nadia Salgado calls la conciencia corporal, right? Amid dictatorship in Equatorial Guinea and US occupation in the Dominican Republic. And so in this chapter, I trace 3 novels in 3 completely different ways that these subjects are engaging in a kind of practice of freedom, what Jessica Johnson calls Black femme freedom, to enact possibilities for themselves that are outside of the wildest imagination of the dictatorship and the kind of imperial occupying force, right? And they do this through like listening and being so in tune with their bodies and engaging in what we would consider like this excess, right? This like sexual and erotic excess that feels so true to them in the moment, but that is also really kind of hated on, for lack of a better word, by everybody else around them, right? And so for me, I was really interested in how these texts that take up the first LGBTQ novel coming out of Equatorial Guinea, La Bastarda, which by the way is also the first novel by a woman writer in Equatorial Guinea to be translated into English. So it's also called La Bastarda in English. The novel by Juan Tomás Habla Laurel, who is a writer from Anawan, called Arde el Monte de Noche, or The Mountain Burns by Night, also translated to English. And then also Nelly Rosario's Song of the Water Saints. So interested in how each of these texts take up the question of erotic and corporeal freedom, a sense of particular kinds of consciousness, in a place that imagines that it's Black, femme, peasant, right? Like colonial subjects have no consciousness, have no sense of their own desires, their own will to live outside of the bounds, the very restricted bounds that are given to them. I was so interested in putting this chapter together because I wanted to trace both how they think about dictatorship and occupation as these long legacies of colonial oppression, but also how, if we kind of look into the intimate lives, right, of people and the way that a dictatorship from far away and an occupation force can impact the intimate lives of Black families, like what you can eat, what you can wear, what you can dress, can you bathe, can you feed your children, right? All these things in every single one of these texts is just so intimate, the way that this power can imbue every part of your life, how resistance gets formed and enacted within those places, right? So this chapter was really trying to say, like, look at everything that's popping off in this body of literature. 3 different novels, 3 different approaches. There's so much happening here. Who's seeing this? Who's reading, like this novels, right? From Equatorial Guinea, this novel from the Democratic, who sees this, right? And for me, that question is like, these literatures are an archive of indictment, right? And they're demanding witnesses. They're demanding for people to see this. Particularly, I was thinking about the work of Equatorial Guinea and the literature that is very much written as a veiled history of what has happened and what continues to happen in Equatorial Guinea, right? And the same thing in terms of the kind of Caribbean context. So what would it mean for us to take this work seriously? And so the next chapter, Witnessing, takes up the question of faithful witnessing, right? Which is a decolonial feminist concept, as both a philosophy and a practice. So building on this kind of long legacy of like continental philosophy, white feminist philosophy, and then decolonial feminist philosophy, thinking about faithful witnessing against Hegelian agonistic notions of recognition, right, against the master-slave dialectic, right, like witnessing as a kind of practice, a phenomenon beyond recognition. But decolonial feminists argue that faithful witnessing is not just the act of witnessing, it is the act of doing, to step in on behalf of, right, to speak up with or for, right, to be able to step in the fray for others. It is one that puts the viewer in danger, right? In order to see resistance, you have to see oppressions and those mechanisms. And you also have to act upon those things, right? And so for me, this question of faithful witnessing became really important, both as thinking through the ways that these novels, and I looked at 2 texts in this chapter, the way that they were looking at religious colonization and the way that they were being faithful witnesses to that, and looking at both, not just like the evils of, you know, Spanish religious colonization in Guinea, but also the kinds of ways that what Tiengo calls the cultural bomb, right? The way that we are enticed and brainwashed into acting, right? And being part of these really violent acts of colonization, right? So like they don't leave themselves out, right? They're saying, this is what happened, this was my place in it. And also here is the way that I am like now thinking about this. Like, how do I bear witness truly to what happened here? What would it mean for me to step into this history and act as a tool against, right, this continual form of colonization? On the other hand, the other part of the chapter looks at the ways that these literary works act as faithful witnesses to gender violence, right? Both gender violence under dictatorship, as well as gender violence after dictatorship, and the ways that it travels across the diaspora and back, the reverberations, right, of this kind of misogyny, heteropatriarchy, and gender violence, and how do we contend with those long legacies of it? How do we ensure, right, that we are not just looking at it, right, just being like, oh no, that's terrible, right, like, but actually acting, right, and engaging in ways to break these kinds of cycles of violence. And so for me, the question of faithful witnessing in this book was like in this chapter was like a threefold thing. So one, I was really interested in how the characters in the book were bearing witness to these phenomena, religious colonization and gender violence, how the authors themselves were acting as faithful witnesses by writing these really hard texts to write, right? They really wanted for both them to be able to say this thing and also for us to be able to see it, right? For the reader to be able to bear witness to this. And then also, what would it mean for us as scholars to take up a hermeneutic, right? A practice of bearing witness, to take seriously, because so much when we think about like literary study, one of the first things I learned as an undergrad in literary studies is like the question of, you know, is this a reliable narrator? Do we believe them, right? The kind of skepticism that we're like, that we are told that we have to have, right? You have to suspend any belief. We can't really believe anything they say. That's like magical realism, right? Like whatever the case may be. How do we fight those kinds of instincts to question, right? Folks who are trying to tell us their histories, their stories, their truths, right? And then the question for me was beyond that, in terms of thinking of faithful witnessing, was also like, how do we bear witness in our everyday lives? What does the politic of faithful witnessing look like in our homes, in our classrooms, in our communities, right? And this is something that I think was really, I really got attached to this, because this is something that I have seen the women in my family do for a long time. And I believe that this is a practice that Black and Indigenous women have had since time immemorial. What would it mean to stand by someone else facing these dehumanizing forms of violence? What would it mean to stand in belief and alongside and create community and kinship with folks, right? So this is not just like some philosophical like pondering, but it's also a practice and an act that we can engage in our everyday lives, and we do, right? And we can we can proliferate it, right? And so for me at the end of this chapter, I was thinking, okay, so faithful witnessing, this shit seems really important. Like, and for me, it became like, faithful witnessing seems like a precondition, right? Like to thinking about decolonization. Because again, in order to be a faithful witness, you have to be able to see power in order to see the resistance, right? And I asked myself, like, well, if faithful witnessing is so important, what is the first thing within a decolonizing politics that we must be able to bear witness to, right? And this is where I move into the question of destierro. And destierro is a Spanish word for exile, not the word, but a word. So the word for exile is exilio, right? But the word destierro doesn't necessarily have an English translation. So it's kind of untranslatable word for exile. And it means to be like forcefully torn or ripped from the earth, right? To be taken out of one's home lands, and literally land, right? To tear from the earth, destierro. And I began to think about the question of diaspora and exile as forms of overlapping dispossession. And in particular, I was thinking about like, what would it mean for me to think about diaspora and exile, not just as a contemporary phenomenon, but one that is thinking about the longue durée of the modern colonial project and the longue durée of the modern capitalist project, right? So the idea that like, we need land accumulation and labor, right? And in order to do so, we need to dispossess people of land, dispossess like actual human beings onto the land of other dispossessed people and have them labor, right? And so for me, thinking about destierro became a way to kind of think through the palimpsest of dispossession for Afro and Indigenous peoples, and to consider both the ideas that are deeply connected to the land itself. So what does it mean to be torn away from your homeland and brought to the homeland of someone else? But also to thinking about like language, cosmology, spiritual practices, foods, you know, cultural practices, and all kinds of understandings of oneself in relation to others, right? Those kinds of kinship understandings. And so destierro is so deeply tied to land, but also it's not only about land, right? And I think to be clear, I come to this question, and it connects to the next chapter, but I come to this question as someone who's like a Black Puerto Rican colonial subject, right? In the United States, like in the settler colonial nation state, on the lands here in the Cayuga lands. And when I was writing this book, I was at Michigan State on the lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, right? Ojibwe land, Odawa land, Potawatomi lands, right? And I thought to myself, like, oh shit, what do I owe, right? To these people, what are my, who am I accountable to in this place, right? And so for me, destierro is important only as much as you can recognize the destierro of someone else as you are reckoning with your own, right? And only as much as you can not only see it as this rampant dispossession, but also as all of these forms of resurgence, like cultural, linguistic, of resurgences, and as reclamation projects, reclamation of lands, right? Reclamation of land-based practices and belief systems. And I started to kind of think about this as this kind of longer practice of thinking about our destierro in relationship to someone else, right? And to other peoples. And so in this chapter, thinking through this destierro, I was looking at two different examples, and one was from the Dominican Republic. The other one was from Equatorial Guinea, obviously. And so the one from DR was like Loida Marita Perez's Geographies of Home, and thinking about both destierro as being torn away from one's lands in the DR, but also being torn away from belief systems, right? And the kind of reclamation of those belief systems as a kind of way to reclaim one's own place in the world, and particularly in the diaspora, and particularly facing anti-Black racism and gender violence, right? There's also these incredible kind of moments in the text where these both pregnant and prepubescent girls have this desire to eat the earth, right? They're eating dirt, they're eating grass, right? They have these excesses in the land. And in this way, we could read this through like medical pathology, right? And particularly this reaches back to chattel slavery in the Caribbean and in the United States, right? To these kind of overseers being like, oh my God, why are these slaves eating all this dirt? And doctors being like, oh yeah, they have, pica or pica, whatever it is, right? Like, and they just have this desire to eat this earth, this non-nutritive substance. And instead to think about it as what would it mean to claim the earth, to desire to be moored to a place from which you've been unmoored. And here I think about Jackie Alexander's work in Pedagogy of Crossing, where she says like, land holds memory, rocks hold memory, water will call you by your ancient name and you will have answered because water always remembers, right? So I think it's interesting to kind of think about what would it mean for us to remember the earth as one part of the paradigm, and the other is like, what is the kind of heresy that is part of the idea of the earth remembering you, right? What would it mean for it to claim you back? And so for me, this kind of question of destierro, on the one hand, dealt with that question of land and memory, right? This kind of two-part memory. And on the other hand, in the kind of context of Equatorial Guinea with the island of Corisco, and thinking about the actual displacement of people by the dictatorship off of their lands, right? And the kind of ways that memory was to remember one's land, to remember the promises made, to remember the kinds of violence of the dictatorship was such a dangerous thing that people forced themselves to forget, right? And that the act of remembering was this intergenerational practice, but one that put you in danger, right? And so in that novel is a question of sacrificing memory and lands, right? For one's place on this island. And so I don't wanna like spoil the rest of the novel, but it's a really beautiful, beautiful text. But for me, what was clear is that they were both thinking about this question of the destierro to be torn from the earth in very different ways, right? Completely different ways, but ones that I think that really resonate and really illuminate one another. So I asked myself at the end of this chapter, like, okay, so destierro is this condition that we are like living through and dealing with in this moment, right? And this is something that I feel so deeply, right? Like, every day, right? Like, as someone who's like, when will my family ever go back to Puerto Rico, like they've always wanted to do, right? How will it ever be possible, right? I thought about what would reparations look like? Like, what would reparations look like for destierro, for these long legacies, these intergenerational forms of dispossession? And I was thinking about this in the context of like non-material and non-positivist ways. So on the one hand, I'm very pro material reparations, whether that be land back, whether that be like monetary reparations, but I also find it like fundamentally a problem for me to think about the kind of calculation of harm to a number, right? To be like, I have calculated, we raped, pillaged, genocided, removed, blah, 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 like shipped off, blah, blah, all these people in. The calculation is $8,300, right? Like, no, you can't, we're not gonna do this, right? With this mathematics. And with this like very modern, very Eurocentric idea of what reparations are, right? So I was really thinking about the ways that these texts themselves, and I have these 3 texts in this, Puerto Rican text, Dominican text, and one from Equatorial Guinea, that think about reparations in very different ways. One of them kind of struggles through thinking about reparations on this kind of capitalist terms, and at the end turns towards thinking about this kind of reparation of the imagination, like, oh, actually, like to refashion capitalist reparations, like buy the block, like, and then sell it back, actually it's a failed reparation. And it's one that kind of ends through thinking about like language, and particularly looking at Spanglish and looking at the kind of beauty within communities that already exist as a potential for reparation. Another one that thinks about imagination and writing as reparation. And then a third novel that actually is thinking about what it means to like struggle. Like the novel is called Matinga, Sangre en la Selva, Matinga, Blood in the Jungle. So what would it mean to kind of think about actual fighting for freedom, reparations as blood, reparations as also new generation. So has a very kind of like pro-natalist approach, one could say, but it also is like deeply imbued with the cosmology of Mamiwata, right? So within this context, I was so interested in how this idea of reparations took on all of these different forms, and none of them relied only on the very basic form of reparation that we are oftentimes forced to deal with here, right? Like reparation only is like an apology and a check, right? And all of these imagined reparations in different contexts and as a reparation of the imagination. What would it mean for us to be able to talk to each other across these overlapping forms of dispossession and to be able to prepare, right? In these kinds of, in community practices, in relational ways for the moment when reparations appears, right? Or when our fight for reparations actually comes to fruition. And the reason why I moved to this chapter in this way is because I was at a conference many years ago where it was Black and Indigenous folks talking about reparations. And they were talking about the kind of moments of not seeing each other, these incommensurabilities, right? And one moment someone said, you can have the mule, but the 40 acres are ours, right? And I sat there as someone who was like, not even from this country, you know what I'm saying? I was just like, oh shit. Okay, so what is my place even in this conversation as a Black Puerto Rican colonial subject here? How do we begin to think about what reparations can look like when we're not fighting over the kind of what is being offered to us, right? The pittance that is being offered to us, right? And what would it mean for us to reimagine reparations and to really to sit with what reparations can look like for us on our terms in a way that don't fundamentally undercut each other, right? And we don't have to continue those forms of not seeing each other. And so in thinking about reparation and thinking about the reparation of the imagination as like folks who are dealing with and oftentimes broken by the coloniality of power, I was thinking about futurities and what do futures look like within the context of the Afro-Latinx Caribbean and the Afro-Hispanophone worlds, right? And so in the chapter Apocalypso, I built on the work of Jamaican writer Michelle Cliff. In particular, I read her essay that is called In My Heart, a Darkness, from her book, If I Could Write This in Fire. And in that book, she writes about the limits, right, of the white imagination. And she talks about the ways that they have constructed an idea of who Black people are. And when you don't fit that, like they just short circuit, right? Like, and so she writes in there as someone who is like a white passing Jamaican, like a white passing Black woman, right? She's a Black Jamaican woman, but she's real light skinned, right? Or she was, may she rest in power. And so she talks about like, being at events as a literary, person, as a literary writer. And white folks feeling very comfortable with her presence there, right? And saying things that they would never say in front of Black people or people of color, right? Showing their racism to her. And then there's the moment where she reveals herself to be Black, or she reveals herself to be Jamaican. And she says, because of the limit of their imagination, right? They couldn't possibly like put it together, right? Like they don't believe her, right? Or they're like kind of in suspense. And so she says, when the other appears to be the one, Apocalypso, right? That's the sentence. Like that's the equation for her. So when this Black person appears to be you, a white person, it is the explosion of the white imagination, right? So I was really thinking about this question and this kind of equation, when the other appears to be the one, Apocalypso, as a way to think about the future work and the kind of ways that Afro-descendant people, in particular Afro-Latinx and Afro-Hispanophone folks, are thinking about and engaging worlds otherwise. Other logics that are not colonial logics, other ways that they explode the white imagination by engaging in practices, belief systems, and imaginations that just go beyond what is possible, right? And so the chapter is split into two. So the first chapter, I'm thinking through Santeria and Lukumi as these spiritual practices. I'm looking at a young adult novel, Shadow Shaper, and then I'm looking through the kind of work Ibeyi, the Afro-Cuban French twins singers. So their album, their first album, and their kind of music video images, and thinking about the ways that these works work against these colonial logics that say there's a past, a present, and a future, right? Ancestors and ghosts don't exist, right? These things don't matter. And the way that these practices, in particular thinking through the question of Santeria and Lukumi as an example of ritual and Afro-syncretic practices that bring our Black ancestors into the present, right? Ensure that that we honor their lives, and use and understand them as the key to our own futures, right? So for me, it's this moment in which a colonial logic would be like these countless dead and enslaved people under the sea and in these lands that are not their homelands don't matter anymore, right? Stop talking about it. And instead, these practices say, no, their Black lives mattered in the past. They are cared for and loved in the present, and they are completely essential to our future, right? We need them. They open the path for us in every way. And so in that chapter, I'm tracing these like elegies and these practices and these songs that open the path, that beg the path to be opened, and the way that they are thinking as this future work, this practice, as something that is also ancestral in the past. So the future work and what we would consider like Afrofuturism, and I talk a little bit about like why it could be Afrofuturism, but I don't name it that in the book, you know, like for a few reasons, but how it's not intent on a future somewhere else in space on another planet, but the future is the kind of reclamation of our past, right? And it is constantly being made. And the second part of that chapter looks at literally the end of the world, the apocalypse, and the way that writers in a short story and in a novel from Equatorial Guinea are imagining literally the end of the world, the dying seas, the kind of ecological crisis that we're in from the perspective of folks who are on islands, right? The folks who are now feeling, first to feel the effects of climate change, right? And also think about the ends of worlds and these futures as a boomerang effect, right? This is the boomerang effect of colonialism, as Amy Cesar says, and this is something that is coming for Europe. It is coming for the quote unquote first world. And there are like 40-foot tall zombies and people living in like trees. Like it's really incredible imagination in terms of thinking about what the ends of worlds would look like. And within them, it is young Black girls that are like the linchpin, the key, right, to the salvation within these completely different traditions, right? They're both thinking it's this little Black girl that is the only key for us to save ourselves, right, and to save each other. So I thought that was really interesting. So I end the book by thinking about the sea. So this is the coda where I trace the fact that the sea has come up in every single chapter, but I didn't get to talk about it because I was already like over my word count. So in the end, I say like, you know, this is where the sea appears in all these places. And I trace the poetry of two poets, Raquel y Lombre del Pozo Epita, who is a Spanish Guinean, who was a Spanish Guinean poet. And then also the work of Araceli Girmay, who is an African-American, Puerto Rican, and Eritrean poet, as well as the cover image by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. And for me, I look at the ways that the poetry kind of encapsulates every single theme: relations, intimacy, witnessing, the tierra, reparations, right? Apocalypso. And then I look at the way that Maria Magdalena Campos Pons' piece, which you see here on the cover of the book, it's also on the inside of the book, how it creates for us a different kind of map, right? Rather than the kind of maps that I showed at the beginning, which is like, this is where this place is, and this is where that place is, and this is, right? Like, and this is the kind of traditional map that we're used to looking at. This image, it's called De las Dos Aguas, right? Of the two waters. And it's Maria Magdalena Campos Pons with herself, right? Her hair is locked up, covering her face, locked up within this like little canoe, right? We see these four people, right? These four men or orishas in the ship. We see her hair locked up with these little brown paper bags. She's holding them in her hands, and they're also like anchoring the ship down. She has this like blue background behind her, all in white on one side, all in blue in the other. And then the bags have these little circles. The little circles say, this is not art. But you have to be like, this is a really giant installation. I think each one of these is like at least a foot long, right? So you put it up, it's, you know, 3 feet by 4 feet. It's really large on the wall, and it's kind of separated. And so I think about this question of like, this is not art, right? And I think about like, well, what lies beneath the sea is not art. It's history, it's our ancestors, right? It is the kind of things that we're seeking to recuperate. But this is likewise a different kind of map of De las Dos Aguas. She's not only Afro-Cuban, but she's Afro-Cuban Chinese, right? What would it mean for us to think about the way that she's mapping Las Dos Aguas in different ways? What if we thought about this within the context of Lukumi, right? Of her being like Obatala and Yemaya, right? Like, what would it mean for us to kind of think about these two waters across a series of logics in the Afro-Atlantic? And I think I'll just end with thinking about decolonial love, because this is something that I developed throughout the book, the definitions of decolonial love. I kind of continue to revisit it. And it's something that really kind of propelled me forward, particularly in times when I was like, oh my God, I cannot finish this project. This project is too big, you know? So these are two quotes from the book. So decolonial love as future work is envisaged through our past, is necessarily a technology for social transformation, which is a quote from Chala Sandoval. And as a method through which we can reimagine human being as praxis, which is also kind of pulled from the work of Sylvia Wynter, which actually opens the book with an epigraph of her work. And then the second one, decolonial love manifests as attention to 1492, to the past before it, to the past since, the subterranean roots created by it, and the dead beneath the sea. It can be imagined as looking into the vast and inconsolable sea to make visible what was disappeared and make perceptible futurities beyond colonization. I think that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Figueroa-Vásquez. I wish you were here in Houston so I could ask you to sign my book. We have a couple of questions. I'll do just the one of them before I give it back to Margarita to tell us some news and tell us goodbye. So the question is, in the talk, you asked the question, who sees this? Referring to the novels being produced in and out of Equatorial Guinea. I would love to know a little more about this. How does the literature circulate? Is it taught in schools there? Is there a genre that is especially popular and or a genre that you have observed in your own research as especially generative for decolonial thinking?
Sorry, that's a really great question. Thank you so much. So in the book, when I talk about who sees this, that was the question that I get from this Vietnamese American novel, Letty Diem Tweez, The Gangster We're All Looking For. It's a novel that is like really close to my heart that I used to teach a lot and still do teach whenever I get the chance to bring in other diasporic work. And it's one that is like, you know, we have these scripts that are told to us about ourselves, but then we also have these knowledges and these experiences where we actually see something else, right? And who gets to see the kind of love and kinship that we share in our communities when we're just told that we're like pathological peoples, right? So that novel for me really shows that. But in terms of thinking about Equatorial Guinea, the question of who sees this becomes important. The novels are not taught in school. None of this work the majority of this work is not allowed to even exist in the country itself. The political repression is extreme. There are no oppositional political parties. There's no free press. There is only one bookstore, and it is on the island of Bioko in the city of Malabo. That's one bookstore for the entire country. And it is covered in biographies of the dictator. So there's very little circulation of this work, and yet still folks agitate and still create and write these novels that are these, like I said, these veiled histories, right? They tell you about something that happened that might have really happened or really happened, right? Like this is actually what went down. And that becomes important, but it's also like dramaturgy. Like there's all of these kind of community work that happens in terms of plays and ways to involve the community and kind of telling their own stories. But even those are always subject to the whims of the dictatorship. And so in one of the chapters, I talk about I think maybe in the first chapter, I talk about, I was talking to a playwright who does all this incredible work in Equatorial Guinea in this community that is really suppressed. And he talks about like the dictatorship. We're like sitting outside in Malabo, and he's like, this like dictadura like muerde, it bites, you know, como sol, pica, like it burns, it itches, you know. He's like, it's everywhere. It's our whole, it's everywhere in our lives, you know. And yet, and still, like, they created like a community center where I went and I saw like the youth doing this incredible work there, and doing all of these really amazing performances. And yet, like, just a few months later, it was shut down by the dictatorship. But you can see that there's constant agitation, constant ways for folks to engage in these resistance practices, even though they are subject to so much of this repression. And then one of the things that the writers have said to me, you know, we just want to be seen. We want someone to read our work. We want someone to know that this is going on. And that's, you know, oftentimes what they say to me whenever I'm like, so what do you think? You know, even the writer, when I was with the writer Juan Tomás Abel Laurel, when I was talking to him about his book, Pangarrilene, I was in Barcelona. He was like, this is my new book. And I read it in one day and I went to go talk to him the next day about it. And I was like, yo, like, is this Afrofuturism? He was like, you're the second person to say that. What is Afrofuturism? You know, like, what is it? And he was like, and do you think it will, if I say that, it will help me sell more novels? You know what I'm saying? And I was like, yes, right? And so there's this like really kind of incredible, I think this kind of incredible insurgency in the writing itself. So novels are constantly being produced in Equatorial Guinea or by Equatorial Guinean writers. There's a lot of urgency in the writing. Like, so oftentimes, like, if you're like a straight up literary critic, you'll be like, oh, well, you know, I don't like the form, or I didn't like this, or the, you know, the arc, blah, blah, blah. But like literally they're writing under such duress that you really have to read with a different point of view. You have to read with a different attitude, right? Instead of like trying to read it with a kind of first world critic, right? Or trained critic eye. And then, so I think the novels are the kind of the bread and butter of the situation, but there's like incredible work in like plays and drama and poetry as well as essays. So hopefully they answer the question.
Yes, thank you so much, Margarita.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Figueroa-Vásquez, not just for this wonderful talk, but for the work that you're doing, right? The way that you answered that question, how important and urgent it is. And I appreciate you bringing it to us. Thank you also to Kimberly Jones for moderating, to John Waterhouse and Eric Granquist for the tech help, because it's really important. And of course, to you all for joining us. A quick announcement before we conclude. Next Wednesday, November 17th at noon, we'll be having our next speaker in the CAAS lecture series, Dr. Leonard Wanchicon, the James Madison Professor of Political Economy at Princeton, and the founder and president of the African School of Economics and Pan-African Scientific Research Council. His talk is titled Education Spillovers, Evidence from Colonial Schools in Benin. So we hope you can make it. And as always, please stay tuned for more events. Check out our page, caaas.rice.edu/events. I put it also in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and have an absolutely fabulous night. Thank you.